Hi, let me know if you can see me and if you can hear me. Hi, hi, hi. Hello, I hope I'm here. Just checking to see if I'm here. Yes, I am very much here. Hi and welcome back. We are doing grade 12 today, and more specifically we are doing the enemy, and we are doing the very last segment of the enemy actually. So this is the very last segment of our very last lesson for grade 12 for your term 1 portions. So far we've done the first two portions of the enemy, the entirety of the Flamingo textbook, and we've done the third level in Vistas. Before we get into today's lesson, or well, this segment of today's lesson, because we also did part 2 today, I just want to say to anyone who might be watching this later, or anyone who might be new here, who is maybe here right now, hi, I'm Shree. I'm your educator for grades 11 and 12, and I teach English. And as I said, we've done part 1 and part 2 of the enemy, so we are about to start part 3. Before we do, I'm just going to give you a very quick review of what we did in part 1 and part 2. Give me a second to grab some water. Okay, so in part 1 and part 2, the enemy is located in Japan. It is situated in the time period of the Second World War. And what is happening in the enemy is that a Japanese doctor finds an American prisoner sort of right outside his house. And he's been trained all these years to think of the Americans as his enemies, right? So when he sees this person, he's sort of unsure what to do. And he and his wife, Hannah, basically decide to sort of bring the prisoner in and take care of him because he's wounded and he's on the verge of dying. Sadao, who is the doctor, even performs a surgery on him to save his life. But throughout all of this, he and Hannah are extremely conflicted on what they're doing. They're not sure that they're doing the right thing. They're not sure what they're doing, in the sense that they're like, are we really like being good Japanese people if we are helping someone who is the enemy of our nation? So a lot of conflict is going on there. One other thing that's happened is that the servants of their house, who worked with Sadao and Hannah for a long time, have decided to leave because they do not think that keeping this white man in their house and taking care of him is the right thing to do. And that is where we are at right now. One thing happens wherein Sadao is called upon to go take care of the general, who is the general of Japan's armies, who is a very important political figure to Japan. And Sadao is one of the best surgeons in the country, so of course the general wants Sadao to look after him. And Sadao has in fact not gone off to war with the troops because he is looking after the general. So the general has very selfishly sort of kept Sadao in Japan for himself. And a messenger comes home basically from the palace to sort of say, oh, we want Sadao. And Hannah gets really freaked out because she's sort of like, oh no, has somebody found out about the prisoner, and are we going to get arrested? And Sadao sees her fear, and he realizes he has to do something about this, and he's not sure what he's going to do, but he's certain that he's going to do something, and he heads off to go take care of the general. Right, that's where we're at. That is a really quick summary of everything we've read so far. I'm going to get into the actual lesson now, and for that what I'm going to do is I'm going to be reading every paragraph out to you, and we're going to be understanding that paragraph together. If you have any questions, then leave them for me in the chat, and I will definitely get back to you on replies to those as soon as I can. Okay, all right then. Of course, the general said deeply. I understand fully. That is because I once took a degree in Princeton. So few Japanese have. I care nothing for the man, Excellency, Sadao said, but having operated on him with such success. Yes, yes, the general said, it only makes me feel you more indispensable to me. Evidently, you can save anyone. You are so skilled. You say you think I can stand one more such attack as I have had today? Not more than one, Sadao said. So what's happening here is that Sadao has told the general what's happened with this man that he found on the shore, that he's then taken into his house and sort of fixed the operation that he performed in his house very impromptu. And the general says, oh yes, I understand. And I understand because I took a degree in Princeton, which is in USA, once. And he says somehow that this degree in Princeton lets him understand what's going on with Sadao and this American man that he's sort of taken into his house. And you'll see what the general means in a little bit. He says another line about Americans and Japanese, and we'll understand it more fully there. And the general says, so few Japanese have, so the Japanese can't really understand what's going on here because they haven't been to the US and they don't really know. They haven't really met people there. So a little bit the implication here might be, oh, I've met people from the US too, and I think they're people too, and because of that, well, I understand that you sort of just went ahead and did this. And Sadao was sort of I don't care about the man. So he's trying to be very clear on that front. He's it's not that I care about him, it's just that I operated on him, and I operated on him successfully, and so I can't bring myself to report him or kill him or anything like that, and I don't want to be some sort of accessory or accomplice to his murder because I kept him alive for this long, and he is proof of my skill. And also I am a doctor, and as a doctor I want to save his life, not kill him. So all of that is implied in what Sadao says there. And the general says yes, and the general stops thinking about the man and he starts thinking about himself, and he's yeah, that makes you all the more valuable to me. Indispensable means I cannot discard you, I cannot be without you, you are extremely important to me. And why does the general say that? Because the general is in a pretty bad state of health. He's having some sorts of attacks. It's not quite clear what they are, but the general's basically might need an operation at some point if he keeps having attacks like this, and so he needs Sadao around to make sure that Sadao can save him. And that's why he's oh, you're so skilled, you can save anyone. Clearly this one that you saved from the beach is just proof of that, so I can't lose you. And then he's sort of asking Sadao about his own health, and he's you think I can make it through one more attack I had today? And Sadao's yes, but only one. Then certainly I can allow nothing to happen to you, the general said with anxiety. His long pale Japanese face became expressionless, which meant that he was in deep thought. You cannot be arrested, the general said, closing his eyes. Suppose you were condemned to death and the next day I had to have my operation. And the general's okay, then, well, if something happens to me, then I can't have anything happen to you. And he's thinking about it, and he's really anxious because he doesn't want to have Sadao be arrested and then on the verge of dying when the general needs this possible medical procedure. There are other surgeons, Excellency, Sadao suggested. And Sadao, sort of just oh, but there are other surgeons and they could operate on you. You don't have to worry about that. And well, Sadao doesn't really mean that, right? He doesn't exactly want to be thrown into prison or arrested or executed. He's just saying that to push the general to realize that he is the only surgeon who is capable of being excellent. None I trust, the general replied. The best ones have been trained by Germans and would consider the operation successful even if I died. I do not care for their point of view. He sighed. It seems a pity that we cannot better combine the German ruthlessness with the American sentimentality. Then you could turn your prisoner over to execution, and yet I could be sure you would not murder me while I was unconscious. The general laughed. He had an unusual sense of humor. As a Japanese, could you not combine these two foreign elements? He asked. So Sadao makes that comment about like, oh, you could get operated on by other surgeons, and the general's like, no, I can't really. And that's what Sadao wants him to like sort of arrive at, right? I mean, Sadao wouldn't have like risked telling the general this unless he knew that like he was relatively like indispensable to the general, because otherwise he'd be risking himself, he'd be risking his wife and his children. So the fact that he's openly told the general about everything that's gone down in his house suggests that he knows that the general is unlikely to like do anything to him. So this is just Sadao probably like pushing at the general to say, no, no, you're the best, and I know that. So he's pushing the general to that realization, and the general like expands, right? He's sort of like, well, the best surgeons that I know have been trained by Germans, and then he talks about sort of the German philosophy, and he says that the German philosophy is extremely ruthless, which is to say that they're sort of they don't really have like any sort of softness in them. That's what he's trying to say. And he's sort of like, oh, if they like finish the operation, then they're going to think that it's fine even if I die. And that's again like, it isn't literally true, right? That doesn't mean that like a doctor who's been trained in Germany would, you know, kill his patient and then be completely okay with it. It's just a suggestion that their philosophy is that even if there are like terrible consequences, if like whatever you set out to do sort of worked out, then it's okay. The collateral damage is just fine. And that is what he considers the German philosophy, ruthlessness. And he's like, and I'm sure that would filter down into medicine too, and I don't really want to like be close to any of those people, because they're not really trained like in a way where they care very much about their patients, or like really think that saving the patient is what like is the right way out of like an operation or something like that, you know. That's the implication there. And he's saying seems a pity that we cannot better combine the German ruthlessness with the American sentimentality. And here he's saying that America has another philosophy which is very different from Germany, which is sentimentality. And why does he say that? He is referring to this impulse of Sadao's to save this man who's like been out there on the beach, as sentimental. You know, it's something that is done from some sort of impulse in your heart. So here he's associating ruthlessness with Germany and that sort of sentimentality with America. And so he thinks basically that Sadao does like care for the life of the American, even if he doesn't care about the American himself. The fact that Sadao operated on him to save him suggests that something in him is sentimental, in a way that the general thinks is American. And that's what's going on here. And he says, well, you know, if you were capable of being both ruthless and sentimental, then I would know that like you could sort of just give your prisoner away, and then you could operate on me if you were ruthless enough. But you're not ruthless enough. I can see like some sort of softness in you. So I can't be sure that if like I force you to send the prisoner away, then, you know, you could like maybe murder me. When I'm unconscious, who knows what you would do to me. So the general's basically saying like, you don't have the heart to turn that prisoner over to like the police, and I know it, I can see it. You don't want that on your conscience, and that's very American of you, is the implication here. But if you could turn him away, then it would be German of you. And he's sort of asking Sadao, could you do that? Like, could you turn him away and then still like take care of me perfectly and properly without like risking my life? So he's asking Sadao essentially in this particular paragraph, will you turn the prisoner over? Sadao smiled. I am not quite sure, he said, but for your sake I would be willing to try, Excellency. And Sadao was sort of like, I'm not sure, but I can try for you. And he's flattering the general, right? That's what's going on here. Hello, Noral, and hello to Mr. Tubelight. Let me know if you have any questions. I will get back to you at any point of time. I will keep like checking the chat, yeah? I am very much here, I think. Okay. Um, I'm gonna carry on and like keep reading this paragraph out to you and explain it. The general shook his head. I had rather not be the test case, he said. He felt suddenly weak and overwhelmed with the cares of his life as an official. In times such as these, when repeated victory brought great responsibilities all over the South Pacific. It is very unfortunate that this man should have washed up on your doorstep, he said irritably. And the general sort of like, no, you don't have to like make me your lab rat for whether you can be ruthless or not. I don't want to be the consequence of you being like sentimental in the middle of the surgery and maybe just even accidentally like misoperating on me or causing me some kind of damage. So the general is very preoccupied with himself here. He sort of doesn't care at all about like Sadao, he doesn't care at all about the prisoner, right? Even here when he says like, oh, like I can't like let anything happen to you, he means I can't let anything happen to you so that nothing happens to me. So everything according to the general comes back to him and his cares for himself. And so here too the general sort of like, okay, no, I don't care about that man and I don't care about you, but like if you kill me then that's going to be a problem. And he's feeling extremely exhausted because, well, first of all, he's just had a surgery. But no, he's not had a surgery. Sorry, he's had some sort of like medical attack, and so he's weak already because of that. But he's also weak because he doesn't want to juggle this problem. You know, he's like, this is too much. And he's saying that he's the official, like he's the person in charge of like a lot of things in Japan and people look up to him, right? And he has to set the right example. But this is a very complicated situation for even him to be in. And he's like, I don't want to be here in this position at this moment. And so he's like, it's extremely unfortunate that this man should have washed up on your doorstep. It's like, why did this happen? Why did this man like show up on your doorstep of all the doorsteps that he had to show up on? And that irritability goes back to like that moment when Sadao, for instance, was extremely irritated, say at like Hannah, because like she couldn't like really focus. No, sorry, Sadao was really irritated at the man that he was operating on because he couldn't go to Hannah and he couldn't take care of her, and the man was like bringing this problem into their house. And just like that, the general also is irritated at the situation at Sadao and at the complications that have come to his job and his life, right? So we see a parallel, surprisingly, between Sadao and the general, insofar as they've both been like disturbed by what has happened, and they're both surprisingly conflicted by what has happened, but both for very different reasons, right? Sadao is conflicted about it because he doesn't want to like hand a person into the police. He doesn't want to have their death on his hands. And the general is conflicted because he doesn't want to accidentally end up killing himself. So a sort of consideration for others versus a consideration for self is the difference between Sadao and between general and Sadao. I feel it so myself, Sadao said gently. It would be best if he could be quietly killed, the general said. Not by you, but by someone who does not know him. I have my own private assassins. Suppose I send 2 of them to your house tonight, or better, any night. You need know nothing about it. It's now warm. What would be more natural than that you should leave the outer partition of the white man's room open to the garden while he sleeps? And the general's like, okay, the only way I can see out of this is assassination. Let's just sort of quietly kill him. And why is that? Because if Sadao turns in that person, you know, then they'll still know that like Sadao has operated on that man, and it's still likely that Sadao will face some sort of inquisition, some sort of interrogation. Something might still happen to Sadao, and because of that, again, it might affect the general because like maybe he will misoperate on the general or like harm the general while he's operating on the general. So the general's like, okay, the only way out of this is to get you off scot-free. We will assassinate the man. Nobody ever has to know he was ever there. And how we'll do this is I'll send you like my private assassins, maybe tonight or better yet any night, so you don't know when they're coming. You'll be like completely clueless. It won't be like you won't be involved in it at all, right? So you couldn't have stopped it is kind of the implication. It won't be your fault, it won't be on your conscience, you know. And like honestly, what could be more like normal than for you to just leave like a part of the white man's room open, you know, because it's really hot outside and so he needs some breeze, so just leave the room open. And that way the assassins can get in through there also is the implication. Certainly it would be very natural, Sadao agreed. In fact, it is so left open every night. And Sadao's like, actually that is normal, and like actually we already leave it open all the time. Good, the general said, yawning. They are very capable assassins. They make no noise and they know the trick of inward bleeding. If you like, I can even have them remove the body. And the general's like, oh good, good, we have all of the conditions for the murder ready. They're very good assassins, don't worry about it, you won't hear any noise. They also know how to like inward bleeding without like kind of like slitting someone's throat or something very externally violent, you know. They know how to like puncture a person or like injure a person exactly in one place so that they sort of start bleeding from the inside and die slowly because of that. And so that's what the general is saying. They won't really leave any sort of evidence on the body or anything. And actually, like, I can remove the entire body if you want. Sadao considered. That perhaps would be best, Excellency, he agreed, thinking of Hannah. So Sadao has sort of made his decision. He's like, yes, okay, have them remove the body, have them murder him, and then remove the body. And he says that in making this decision, he's thinking about Hannah, and he's thinking about the sort of panic that she was in. He left the general's presence then and went home, thinking over the plan. In this way, the whole thing would be taken out of his hands. He would tell Hannah nothing, since she would be timid at the idea of assassins in the house, and yet certainly such persons were essential in an absolute state such as Japan was. How else could rulers deal with those who opposed them? And Sadao is actually quite okay with this plan. He goes home, he's still thinking about it, but he feels okay about it because he feels like everything's been taken out of his hands. You know, it's not like this is something he suggested. It's not like this is something he wanted. The general suggested the plan. The general will sort it out. The general will take care of everything. Sadao basically has to do nothing except stay quiet. And people find it incredibly easy to stay quiet and to not feel responsible if they stay quiet, right? Because it's such a small thing. You're just omitting like a small detail while like talking to someone, and so really you're not hiding that big a thing, or you're not really contributing in that big a way. And silence becomes like one of the most key ways in which people become complicit in doing terrible things, and this is like a great example of how, right? Sadao is becoming complicit in this murder, and yet he thinks it's not in my hands. I'm not like really the one like doing any of this. And he also decides that he's not going to tell Hannah about this because he thinks that she will be like frightened at the idea that there'll be assassins in the house. And he's like, but like assassins are absolutely essential to places like Japan. And what does that mean? Japan is an absolutist state, which is to say that it's not a democracy, right? It's a place in which certain things are just not acceptable, and all decisions are made by the governing people, and those governing people weren't elected by the people of the country. So very often, like, nothing that can be said against the governing people is allowed because they want to remain in complete and total power of the entire country. They don't want any kind of dissent. They don't want anyone speaking against them or questioning them. So those rumors that we were talking about earlier about how the state like murders its, tortures its prisoners. Yeah, rumors like that have to be passed around in absolute secret, and they can only remain rumors. If it became like a big deal, if people started like protesting about it, then they would be murdered, right? And the people of the state clearly know that. There's a reason that Yumi was so afraid of like being associated with the house in which a white man was being kept and saved. And yeah, so they use like assassins to like murder people secretly wherever they need to, especially if the person in question has some sort of fame or some sort of popularity generally. Because like if you murder people who are deeply respected in society publicly, then you're going to have like a lot of people outraged. Instead, you murder them silently and you fix your problem before it even begins. That sounds extremely cold, but that is how like some states really do exist like that. Checking for questions. Nurul, that's a good question. It seems right now as though he's sort of just like, well, everything is going to be okay now. It seems like that, right? And that's where he starts off. He starts off feeling like a little bit relieved in that particular paragraph. But as we go in, we'll see how that relief is a lot more complicated than like he thinks it is. He refused to allow anything but reason to be the atmosphere of his mind as he went into the room where the American was in bed. What else could be the atmosphere of his mind? Sentimentality. American sentimentality, as the general called it. So he's trying very hard to like not think about what's going to happen. He's trying very hard to not feel like, oh no, poor man, he's going to get murdered. He's trying to be like, I'm going to be reasonable. And the most reasonable thing in this situation is for me to allow this man to be murdered. That way I'll have very little to do with it, and the job will still get done, and I will still be safe. So everything works out this way. And the very fact that Sadao has to like force himself to think like this, right, suggests that he is discomfited by the idea that like assassins are going to come by and murder the American. It's not a plan that he's happy about. It's not a plan that he wants to happen necessarily, but he sort of thinks, okay, there's no other way out. I'm helpless here, and so I'll just have to go ahead with it. And already, Nurul, we see that sort of complication, right? It's not just relief anymore. It's sort of forced relief in Sadao's mind. But as he opened the door, to his surprise, he found the young man out of bed and preparing to go into the garden. What is this? He exclaimed. Who gave you permission to leave your room? I'm not used to waiting for permission, Tom said gaily. Gosh, I feel pretty good again. But will the muscles on this side always feel stiff? Is it so? Sadao inquired, surprised. He forgot all else. Now I thought I had provided against that, he murmured. He lifted the edge of the man's shirt and gazed at the healing scar. Massage may do it, he said, if exercise does not. And he goes into the room where the American is generally lying in bed, but the man is out of bed and he's like actually like planning to go outside into the garden through which the assassins are going to arrive someday now. And Sadao's like, who gave you permission to leave? And Tom is like, oh, you know, I don't really think about permission or like care about permission. I just do whatever I want. And, you know, I'm feeling quite good now. But like the muscles on like the side that you operated on are like stiff. And Sadao is sort of like, oh. And now he's forgotten about everything else. He's only focused again on the body, on like the fact that he's a doctor and he, you know, is treating this wound and he wants to treat this wound the best that he can. And he's like, I thought like I'd already ensured that you wouldn't feel stiff. And he actually like looks at the scar, he checks it, and he's like, well, maybe if you get some massages or like if you get some exercise, it'll help out and you'll be fine. All very ironic because just now he was plotting Tom's murder with the general. So Tom is very much not going to be fine. And yet Sadao can't help being a doctor in this moment and taking care of Tom. It won't bother me much, the young man said. His young face was gaunt under the stubbly blonde beard. Say, doctor, I've got something I want to say to you. If I hadn't met a Jap like you, well, I wouldn't be alive today. I know that. Sure, I know that, Tom went on warmly. His big, thin hands gripping a chair were white at the knuckles. I guess if all the Japs were like you, there wouldn't have been a war. Perhaps, Sadao said with difficulty. And now I think you had better go back to bed. He helped the boy back into bed and then bowed. Good night, he said. And Tom is sort of trying to reassure like Sadao back. He's like, you know, it's fine. Like the stiffness doesn't like bother me that much. And like, thank you. You know, if it wasn't for you, I know that I wouldn't be alive. And Sadao, well, he just planned this young man's death. So again, he can't speak. He's finding it extremely difficult. So the guilt is showing up again. And Tom goes on, right? He's like, if like all the Japanese were like you, and like, what does that mean? We don't know. And we'll talk about it in a moment after we're done discussing this paragraph. And Tom's like, if all of the Japanese are like you, then there wouldn't have been a war. And the implication is sort of that If all Japanese cared about other people like you, or if all Japanese were kind like you, or if all Japanese were considerate like you, then there wouldn't have been a war. And this is an especially bitter moment for Sadao because he just, again, as we just saw, discussed the murder of this young man. So Sadao can't really agree with that. So he says maybe, and he says it with difficulty because guilt again. And he says, okay, you should go to bed. And he says good night, and he leaves. Right? So immediately after, he makes this plan to murder Tom with the general. He comes back home. He meets Tom. He talks to Tom, and he feels a slow resurgence of guilt taking place in him again. But despite that, he doesn't really warn Tom, right? And that's interesting also. Sadao slept badly that night. Time and time again he woke, thinking he heard the rustling of footsteps, the sound of a twig broken or a stone displaced in the garden, a noise such as men might make who carried a burden. So that night, he thinks the assassins are going to come, and he doesn't sleep very well. He keeps waking up again and again. He keeps wondering if the assassins are here, if they're not here. He hears footsteps, he thinks he hears movement in the garden, noise such as men might make who carried a burden. And this burden might be the fact that they have to carry instruments that they used to kill the American, or it might just be that they carry the burden of having to murder, because it is a burden to have to murder someone. So he's sort of oh, are these noises the men? It's like when you're really anxious about something and you're really worried about something. Maybe you have a really difficult test tomorrow, and you keep waking up in the middle of the night thinking the test is about to happen and that it's 7 a.m. and time for you to go to school already. Yeah, same thing is happening to Sadao. He's sort of has it happened? Has it happened? Has it happened? Which shows that he is not entirely comfortable with what is going to happen again, right? If he could sleep well, that means that, oh, it's something that he's entirely reconciled himself with. But if he's sleeping badly, it means that it's something that he's struggling with. The next morning, he made the excuse to go first into the guest room. If the American were gone, he then could simply tell Hannah that so the general had directed. But when he opened the door, he saw at once that there on the pillow was the shaggy blonde head. He could hear the peaceful breathing of sleep, and he closed the door again quietly. The next morning, he's sort of oh, okay, I should go check it first, because if Hannah goes there and he is not there, or he's lying there dead, she'll really panic. So he goes there first, and he's okay, if he's not there, if they've removed his body, then I'll just tell Hannah that oh, the general said this is going to happen, and so it happened. Otherwise, he doesn't plan on telling Hannah any of this. He wants to sort of protect Hannah from the, the same anxiety that he, for instance, is facing right now. And it's an anxiety that also has to do with a moral dilemma, right? Is he really doing the right thing? But then he opens the door, and the man is very much still there, and he's just asleep, and he can hear the breath, so he knows that he's just asleep and he's not dead. And he comes back and he's he's asleep, he told Hannah. He is almost well to sleep like that, which is to say, he's almost completely recovered if he's sleeping that well. What shall we do with him? Hannah whispered her old refrain. A refrain is a repetition, something that you've said a lot, and what shall we do with him is the question that Hannah's been asking a lot. Sadao shook his head. I must decide in a day or two, he promised. And Sadao was sort of oh, I'll decide in a day or two. We know that he's sort of already decided, but here he's sort of lying to Hannah because again he wants to protect her. But this turns out to be true, surprisingly, as we'll find out. His decision making is still there's still a decision to be made, right? He could tell Tom even right now and make sure that Tom escapes, or he could choose not to tell Tom, and then Tom would stay and get murdered. And so there is still a decision to make here for Sadao, and even though he hasn't really realized that yet, he will eventually realize it. But certainly, he thought, the second night must be the night. There rose a wind that night, and he listened to the sounds of bending boughs and whistling partitions. Hannah woke too. Ought we not to go and close the sick man's partition? She asked. No, Sadao said, he is able now to do it for himself. But the next morning, the American was still there. And the second day he's like, okay, today the assassins will come. And there's like a really violent wind. He listens to like a storm that's rising up outside the house, and he's sort of like, okay, so in like this sort of storm, maybe they'll come and they'll murder the man. And Hannah wakes up, right? And Hannah wakes up and she's like, oh, there's a storm, shouldn't we close like the door like that's outside the white man's room, because he's sick, and if he like gets like this kind of stormy like wind in, then he's just going to fall more sick, right? And so I was like, no, you don't need to close it. Why? Because the general asked him to keep it open so that the assassins could come there and like actually commit the murder. And so now like explains his like no away by saying he can like get up and do it himself now, you don't need to worry about him. But the next morning the American's still alive, so the assassins have not been sent. Then the third night, of course, must be the night. The wind changed to quiet rain, and the garden was full of the sound of dripping eaves and running springs. Sadao slept a little better, but he woke at the sound of a crash and leapt to his feet. What was that? Hannah cried. The baby woke at her voice and began to wail. I must go and see. On the third night, everything is kind of quiet, but suddenly there's like a big noise, and Sadao like wakes up, and Hannah also wakes up, and she's like, what is that? And she's like, I have to go see what it is. What's interesting in this particular paragraph is that Sadao is sleeping a little better now. 2 days of the American not being murdered and Sadao is sleeping better, which means that Sadao has stopped thinking so much about the assassins coming. He stopped thinking so much about like the American being murdered, and maybe he started to think, oh, it might not really happen, and so he is feeling better, and so he's not like wrecked by anxiety when he goes to bed, so he's sleeping better too. But then they hear a sound that night, and Hannah wants to go see, but he held her and would not let her move. Sadao, she cried, what is the matter with you? Don't go, he muttered. Don't go. His terror infected her, and she stood breathless, waiting. There was only silence. Together they crept back into the bed, the baby between them. But he doesn't let Hannah go see what happened, because he's afraid that it's the assassins who are here, and he's afraid that they might do something to her if she sees them, because they're not supposed to leave any evidence, right? And they're not supposed to be seen, or else their quality as assassins is going to be doubted. So he doesn't let her go, but she doesn't know what's going on, and she's like, what are you doing? And he's just like, don't go. And he sounds terrified, and because he sounds terrified, she feels terrified, and they both just stand there together and they're waiting. Hannah doesn't know for what, but Sadao very much knows what he's waiting for some sort of indication that the American might be dead, some sort of indication that like the assassins have committed the murder. But there's only silence, so they both go back to bed. Checking for questions, because I think Nurul has asked something. Yeah, Nurul, very much, right? The servants were like so against their decision of treating the soldier that they actually like left the house, and they abandoned like being there. They were like, we think you're definitely wrong for doing this. There's also like all of that conversation where they're like, oh, they've been in America for so long that they've started liking Americans, and so they're treating Americans, and they shouldn't do this. And the gardener very much says at one point, like, you should have just left him to like die. You should have just left him to like bleed out. So yeah, their servants are very much against the decision. Yet when he opened the door of the guest room in the morning, there was the young man. He was very gay and had already washed and was now on his feet. He had asked for a razor yesterday and had shaved himself, and today there was a faint colour in his cheeks. I'm well, he said joyously. And today too, the American is still alive, and he is actually quite happy today, and he's like walking around. The day before that, he'd asked for a razor, he's shaved, so there's no like beard on his cheeks, so he looks better also. And there's also color in his cheeks, so blood is coming back to his body is working better, and he in fact says very happily, I'm well. Sadao drew his kimono around his very body. He could not, he decided suddenly, go through another night. It was not that he cared for this young man's life. No, simply it was not worth the strain. And Sadao sort of like pulls his like shirt, the kimono that he's wearing, which is not a shirt, sorry, it's the Japanese traditional wear. He pulls it tighter, and he's sort of like, okay, I can't do this anymore. It's not that I care about this young man's life, it's just that this is really stressing me out. The situation of what's going to happen and what's not going to happen, and is he going to die or is he going to be alive tomorrow, and what are we going to do with him? But the reason that it's stressing him out is also partly because like all these days he's not slept because of the fact that this young man he thought would get murdered, right? So the prospect of the assassins entering his house and murdering the young man has been keeping him from sleep. So in some sense, he also does care what happens to the young man, even though he keeps saying that he doesn't care if he is alive or not. You are well, Sadao agreed. He lowered his voice. You are so well that I think if I put my boat on the shore tonight with food and extra clothing in it, you might be able to row to that little island not far from the coast. It is so near the coast that it has not been worth fortifying. Nobody lives on it because in storm it is submerged. But this is not the season of storm. You could live there until you saw a Korean fishing boat pass by. They pass quite near the island because the water is many fathoms deep there. So Sadao was like, yeah, you're well. And you're so well that if I put my boat on the shore tonight and I put food in it and clothing in it, I think you could row to the island that is near the coast. I think that island would be a good place for you to go to because there's no security there. It's not been worth fortifying, not been worth securing because it's really near the coast, which means that the people on the coast can like keep a lookout of the island, right? There doesn't need to be any sort of separate security for the island. But nobody lives on the island because during like storm seasons, the entire island like is swept over by the sea. It's completely covered by the sea. But right now it is not storm season, and in fact, you, Tom, could live there for like quite a while. In fact, you could live there until you see a boat pass by. And fishing boats like pass by there quite a lot because the water there is deep, and so they get like quite some good fish there. And what Sadao is implying is run away from here, find your way to that island, and from the island, find your way into a boat and away from Japan. The young man stared at him, slowly comprehending. Do I have to? He asked. I think so, Sadao said gently. You understand, it is not hidden that you are here. The young man nodded in perfect comprehension. Okay, he said simply. So the young man is completely understanding what Sadao is saying, which is leave and get out. And he asks, do I have to? Which says he wants to stay here. For all that, he is in enemy territory and he is living with like the Japanese, he still wants to stay with them because they've taken care of him. They've made him better and he's gotten comfortable there. And he's quite safe there. Just in the sense that he's getting fed every day. And somebody is there to take care of his injury. And if he gets out of the house, once again, he's going to be risking his life. And Sadao was like, yeah, you do have to leave because people know that you're here. And that tells the young man that, oh, because of that, he's not safe in the house either. And so the young man's like, okay, cool, then I will go ahead and leave. Sadao did not see him again until evening. As soon as it was dark, he had dragged the stout boat down to the shore, and in it he put food and bottled water that he had bought secretly during the day, as well as 2 quilts he had bought at a pawn shop. The boat he tied to a post in the water, for the tide was high. There was no moon, and he worked without a flashlight. So in the darkness, Sadao is working with he's working without a flashlight. He's working without a flashlight deliberately because he doesn't want anyone to sort of see what he's doing and suspect that he is doing this. He just like puts his boat on the shore, he puts food in it, water in it. He's even gotten like quilts for the man to like sleep on and to like be protected from the cold. So he's bought all of these things. This is a lot of work. This is a lot of effort to go to. So once Sadao decides to like get him out of there, he doesn't just say, oh, get out of my house and survive however you want to. He takes responsibility for the man and he sort of gets him these things and finds him gives him like an escape plan, right, in extreme detail. And all of this tells us that despite whatever Sadao may insist about not caring about this young man and not caring about him being alive, he also doesn't want to be the reason that this young man is dead. So yeah, he definitely tries very much to help the man. When he came to the house, he entered as though he were just back from work, and so Hannah knew nothing. Yumi was here today, she said as she served his supper. Though she was so modern, still she did not eat with him. Yumi cried over the baby, she went on with a sigh. She misses him so. The servants will come back as soon as the foreigner is gone, Sadao said. He goes back home as though like he's just come back from work, and so he doesn't tell Hannah anything about this. And Hannah's talking to him as she's giving him food, and interesting like tidbit which says she's really modern about a lot of things, but she's not like, she doesn't feel comfortable eating with him. She serves him and lets him eat first and then she eats, which is like a customary thing that women do in a lot of places, including India, right? Wives are supposed to serve first and then eat. So that's what Hannah is doing here. And she says, oh, Yumi came by and she really misses the baby, and she cried over the baby, and she's sighing, which says that she also really misses Yumi and the work that Yumi does for her. And so I was like, well, when the foreigner's gone, the servants will come back. And he knows that the foreigner will be gone soon. He's taken things into his own hands, he's taken responsibility for the situation, and he's made a decision. The decision that he thought he would not have to make. He went into the guest room that night before he went to bed himself and checked carefully the American's temperature, the state of the wound, and his heart and pulse. So one last checkup for the American to make sure that he is in a fit condition to go out. The pulse was irregular, but that was perhaps because of excitement. The young man's pale lips were pressed together and his eyes burned. Only the scars on his neck were red. So his heartbeat is sort of erratic, which means that he's sort of like panicking, excited in the sense there's adrenaline rushing through his body, which means that, there's a mix of panic, a mix of like, all right, I need to be at like the top of my energy game. All of that's kind of going on in him, and because of that, his heart is sort of freaking out. His lips are pressed together and his eyes are burning, which suggests that he's got a very intense expression on his face. He's very focused. And only the scars on his neck were red. Again, Sadao's attention seems to sort of be drawn to the, sort of gets drawn to those scars, to like those maybe torture scars. I realize you are saving my life again, he told Sadao. Not at all, Sadao said. It's only inconvenient to have you here any longer. And the man's like, I know you're saving me again. And Sadao's like, no, I'm not saving you. It's just inconvenient for me to have you here. And it's partly true. It is inconvenient for him because it's putting him through a lot. It's putting Hannah through a lot. It's putting everyone through a lot. And it's causing him a lot of moral dilemma that he really doesn't want to have, right? But at the same time, he is still saving that man's life. The consequence of this inconvenience is that he's saving the man's life. He could, for instance, send the general like a message saying, why don't you send the assassins? Or something like that. But instead he like helps the man escape. So there's still a choice that's been made, and it's the choice that allows the man to get away with his life intact. Just like all the choices that Sadao and Hannah have been making in the story are choices that have been leading to this man getting away with his life intact. He had hesitated a good deal about giving the man a flashlight, but he had decided to give it to him after all. It was a small one, his own, which he used at night when he was called. So he'd wondered about whether or not to give the man a flashlight, and then he decides to give the man a flashlight. And why does he wonder whether or not to give it to him? We'll see. It's a small flashlight. It's the flashlight that he uses when he goes out at night, when he's called to look at a patient. If your food runs out before you catch a boat, he says, signal me 2 flashes at the same instant the sun drops over the horizon. Do not signal in darkness, for it will be seen. If you're all right but still there, signal me once. You will find fresh fish easy to catch, but you must eat them raw. A fire would be seen. Okay, the young man breathed. He was dressed now in the Japanese clothes which Sadao had given him, and at the last moment, Sadao wrapped a black cloth about his blonde head. Now, Sadao said. And the reason he hesitates over giving the young man his flashlight is because he's giving the young man the flashlight for a specific purpose, right? It's a way for the young man to contact him from the island. So he is basically making a decision about whether or not to continue taking responsibility for the young man after he is out of his house or not. And in giving him the flashlight, he has decided that yes, I will keep an eye on this man even after he's left. And this is the plan, right? He's sort of like, if you're still on that island and you don't get a boat and your food is gone, then what you have to do is, when the sun is about to set but there is still light in the sky, flash the flashlight twice and I'll see it. Don't flash it in darkness because everyone will see it and they will be suspicious and somebody will come find you. If you're all right but you're still there, then like signal me once, send me the flashlight once. You'll find like fish easy to catch, but you have to eat them raw, because if you try to cook them on a fire, people would see the fire, the smoke also. So again, bunch of like contingency plans for the future. He's sort of like, okay, if you get a boat soon, if you don't get a boat soon, all these like plans upon plans upon plans, and he helps the young man out of this, and he's sort of like, I'm around if you need help, and tell me if you're around also. And the young man sort of like, okay, and now he's dressed in like Japanese clothes which Sadao has given him, and Sadao wraps a black cloth about his blonde head, and that's to hide his hair, right? His hair gives him away as like a non-Japanese like Westerner quite immediately, and it also stands out in the darkness, the blonde hair. And to stop it from like being very obvious, Sadao like wraps it in black cloth so that you can't see the blondness, and then he tells the man to leave. I'm gonna look to see if you have any questions. No questions, so I think everything is absolutely clear then. The young American, without a word, shook Sadao's hand warmly and then walked quite well across the floor and down the step into the darkness of the garden. Once, twice, Sadao saw his light flash to find his way, but that would not be suspected. He waited until from the shore there was one more flash. Then he closed the partition. That night, he slept. So the American leaves. He doesn't really say anything to Sadao, but he shakes his hand warmly, expressing his gratitude, and leaves. The light flashes because he sort of needs to find his way in the darkness, which is, very intense. But Sadao was like, oh, that's okay. Nobody is going to be suspicious of seeing this light like in my garden, because like I do go out sometimes, and like people go out into their gardens and use their flashlights. It's only like from the island that there would be suspicion. He keeps like waiting at the door until he sees like a flash from like all the way along the shore, where the man presumably has to use the flashlight again to find the boat. And then after that he closes the partition and he goes to sleep. The man is gone, and finally, no longer under any kind of stress or tension to do with this man, Sadao can go to bed. You say the man escaped? The general asked faintly. And here we switch like time and scene to a completely different moment. He had been operated upon a week before, an emergency operation to which Sadao had been called in the night. For 12 hours, Sadao had not been sure that the general would live. The gallbladder was much involved. Then the old man had begun to breathe deeply again and to demand food. Sadao had not been able to ask about the assassins. So far as he knew, they had never come. The servants had returned, and Yumi had cleaned the guest room thoroughly and had burnt sulfur in it to get the white man's smell out of it. Nobody said anything. Only the gardener was cross because he had got behind with his chrysanthemums. So it's sometime far in the future, the general has needed an operation, and it's an emergency operation. Sadao has been called for it in the middle of the night, and it's been so bad that Sadao hadn't been sure that the general would live, but now he has made it out alive. And it takes a week for Sadao to talk to him about like the prisoner, because the general has obviously been weak and in serious condition. So Sadao's like, okay, I'll wait on it. And Sadao hadn't had time really, because of all of that, to ask the general about the assassins. And he says, oh, I think they didn't really come, because like as far as I know, there was like no clue that they'd come. And he updates us on what's happening in his house. The servants have come back. Yumi has like cleaned the guest room and gotten rid of the white man's smell, so she's cleansed the entire place. Nobody would ever know that somebody else had lived there now. And none of the servants ever like talk about it again with their masters, and only the gardener like expresses any kind of like discontent, right? And he only expresses it because again he is preoccupied with his work, and he's like, I was taking care of these chrysanthemums, which are flowers, and you know, for one entire like week I couldn't take care of them, so now I'm going to have to put more energy and effort into taking care of them to make sure they're okay. So he's cross, but nobody else is, and nobody else talks about it. But after a week, Sadao felt the general was well enough to be spoken to about the prisoner. Yes, Excellency, he escaped, Sadao now said. He coughed, signifying that he had not said all he might have said, but was unwilling to disturb the general further. But the old man opened his eyes suddenly. And Sadao was like, oh yes, he escaped. So he's not told the general that he played a role in these plans. He's just said it as though the man has just miraculously escaped. And he's sort of like, yeah, he escaped. And then he coughs and he wants to sort of ask about the assassins. But he doesn't want to directly ask because he doesn't want to keep bothering the general. So the cough is sort of a signal, right? It's a non-verbal sign that, oh, I have more to say, but I don't want to disturb you. So if you want to continue the conversation, you can do it. It's the sort of thing that we do like all the time while speaking to each other. For instance, like if you're, you know, if you have something that you disapprove of, you sort of clear your throat, right? Like or something like that, and everybody knows that you're not entirely happy about what's happening, or you have something, some sort of not great comment that you want to make about what's happening, but you're not going to do it because you're polite. That's the implication. And similarly, like that, something like that is happening. That prisoner, he said with some energy. Did I not promise you I would kill him for you? You did, Excellency, Sadao said. Well, the old man said in a tone of amazement. So I did. But you see, I was suffering a great deal. The truth is, I thought of nothing but myself. In short, I forgot my promise to you. I wondered, Your Excellency, Sadao murmured. It was certainly very careless of me, the general said, but you understand it was not lack of patriotism or dereliction of duty. He looked anxiously at his doctor. If the matter should come out, you would understand that, wouldn't you? And interesting conversation here. The general sort of like, I promised you I would kill the man, didn't I? And so I was like, yes. And the general's like, oh well, I forgot about it. You know, I was really preoccupied in my own suffering and my own pain. And it's true, the general is a very preoccupied man. All along we've seen like multiple instances where he's absolutely cared for nothing except himself, and just like that here too, he cares only about himself, and so he forgets that he made this promise to Sadao. And Sadao's like, yes, I also thought about it, and like why, like, you know, why you may have like not sent the assassins. And the general's like, oh, it was really careless, but like, you know, right, that I didn't mean to do it, that I wasn't like, it's not like I cared about the man. I'm definitely very patriotic. I definitely care about Japan, and I would definitely have murdered the man. I would have done my duty. It's just that I was a little like in pain. It's not that the pain like took my attention away from Japan. He doesn't want anybody to ever have to think that, oh, maybe the general took his own like health and like self more seriously than he took his country and concerns of his country. And so he's sort of like, you know, like, you know that. And if the matter should come out, meaning if people should start talking about this or somehow get to know about this, then if you're asked for your opinion, then what you will say is that you know that I really did want to have the man murdered, right? So he's confirming that the doctor won't spread any kind of story where he says something like, oh, yeah, the general, he cares more about himself and his pain than he cares about Japan, or anything like that. Because that would be a really bad look for like a political officer who is supposed to care about his country first and foremost, and be a leader who is sort of that perfect example, right? So he's trying to make sure his image is maintained. Nurul, he doesn't want to turn in the prisoner because he's afraid that Sadao might also get like turned in, because like the prisoner has very obviously been treated, right? And if they start like some sort of inquisition or interrogation and they find out ki, yeah, Sadao like operated on him and saved his life, and then they throw Sadao in prison, and then the general needs like an operation from Sadao, then what will he do, right? And what if Sadao doesn't treat him like properly? He could like force Sadao to treat him even if like Sadao is in prison, but what if Sadao like doesn't operate on him well and then he dies? So self-interest is like the reason that the general doesn't like turn in the prisoner. He doesn't want anything to happen to the doctor, and he can't protect the doctor because that would set a really bad example for the rest of the country. That would be like, oh, you can be excused if you're valuable enough, even if you do like terrible things, then it's okay if like I can use you. And that would make him like, all of his image would fall apart, and as you can see, his image matters very much to him. Certainly, Your Excellency, Sadao said. He suddenly comprehended that the general was in the palm of his hand, and that as a consequence, he himself was perfectly safe. I can swear to your loyalty, Excellency, he said to the old general, and to your zeal against the enemy. And Sadao understands in that moment that the general is so obsessed with like his self-image that the general has sort of like, and the general has given it away, right? He's given away the fact that if the doctor spread apart like some sort of story like this, then the general would very much be in trouble. So it's the general who's in the control of Sadao right now, and so Sadao is going to be completely fine. And so he's like, yes, I'll swear that you're loyal. I'll swear that you hate the enemy. Don't worry about it. I've got your back. And in turn, I know you've got mine, is the implication. Interesting situation again, because like Sadao is in control here, even though the general is technically in control of the entire country. Just like with the masters and the servants, we see how for a brief bit it was the servants who held like power over their masters. Here too, Sadao holds power over his general. So in these moments, like it's entirely possible for people to like hold power even over people who technically sort of dominate over them. So lovely moments like this in the story. You're a good man, the general murmured and closed his eyes. You will be rewarded. And the general's like, oh yeah, you're good, you support me, you're good, I'll reward you. But Sadao, searching the spot of black in the twilighted sea that night, had his reward. There was no prick of light in the dusk. His prisoner was gone. Safe, doubtless, for he had warned him to wait only for a Korean fishing boat. Sadao looks like at the sea that day, and there is no like flashlight, so he knows for sure that like his prisoner is no longer there on the island. He's gone, and his prisoner is also safe, and he calls him his prisoner. Interesting, again, goes back to that moment when Hannah starts calling like the American their prisoner, because for a brief period of time the American was completely under their control and their care, right? And they could have done whatever they wanted to him. And that sort of sense of responsibility translates eventually into Sadao like letting the prisoner escape and helping him escape. So he feels like, so that sense of responsibility is what we see again in his prisoner. But yeah, he's gone now and he's safe. And he's safe, we know, because Sadao's warned him to like go only on a Korean fishing boat, because Korea won't turn him in to Japan. So he's not gone on to like some other fishing boat or some other Japanese fishing boat. He's only gone for help to some place that like will actually help him. And this, he says, is his reward. And that's very interesting also, because not only is it his reward in the sense that he is finally rid of this problem, he is rid of this problem in a way that doesn't cause him any kind of stress, any kind of guilt, any sort of conscientious bad feeling. Everything has worked out, and everything has worked out for the better for everyone. He stood for a moment on the veranda, gazing out to the sea from whence the young man had come that other night. And into his mind, although without reason, there came other white faces he had known. The professor at whose house he had met Hannah, a dull man, and his wife had been a silly talkative woman, in spite of her wish to be kind. He remembered his old teacher of anatomy who had been so insistent on mercy with the knife, and then he remembered the face of his fat and slatternly landlady. So he's standing there and he's looking out at the ocean, and he's thinking about that night when the man first came to that place from the ocean. And as he's thinking about the man, he's also thinking about the other white people that he's known. And he says, without reason. But there is a reason, and we'll think about what it is. He's thinking about the professor, he's thinking about the professor's wife, the people he met where, he met Hannah. He's thinking about his old teachers. He's also thinking about his landlady back when he lived in America. He had had great difficulty in finding a place to live in America because he was a Japanese. The Americans were full of prejudice, and it had been bitter to live in it, knowing himself their superior. He tells us that actually back when he was in America, he had had trouble finding somewhere to live because the Americans were prejudiced against the Japanese, just like the Japanese are prejudiced against the Americans. And he says that it was bitter to live in the prejudice because he knew himself their superior. And well, of course he thinks himself their superior, just like they think themselves his superior, right? Just like the Americans think they're better than the Japanese, this Japanese man thinks he's better than the Americans. Both of these countries have been kind of teaching their people that they're better than everybody else, and so they're all taught to look down on everybody else, and that's the kind of that's inevitably the kind of bitterness and enmity that it creates. It's sort of like you thinking, I'm better than everybody else because I belong to America, and everyone else is less than me. And yeah, the parallels between the American and the Japanese are very, very real here. How he had despised the ignorant and dirty old woman who had at last consented to house him in her miserable home. He had once tried to be grateful to her because she had in his last year nursed him through influenza, but it was difficult, for she was no less repulsive to him in her kindness. Now he remembered the youthful, haggard face of his prisoner, white and repulsive. So even though one woman finally says, yes, you can live here, despite the fact that everybody else has been judgmental to him and doesn't really like the Japanese, so she's showing him a kindness, much as he has shown an American man kindness just recently. Yeah, and he'd hated her, right? Because he'd been oh, you think you're better than me, but you're not. And he'd sort of just also hated her because he's been taught and trained to think that the Americans are terrible. And even though she'd been kind to him, and when he was sick she had taken care of him and made sure that he was okay, he didn't really know how to be thankful to her or appreciate her for it, because he still found her repulsive. It's a mirror to what's just happened. Just like he's taken care of Tom and nursed him through his illness and saved him, this woman had once saved him, and they both saved people that the rest of their country people would have been oh, this person isn't really worth saving. But where Tom has been grateful to the doctor quite openly, the doctor found it quite difficult to be grateful to the woman, and that's because as he says, white people are repulsive to him. And after he goes through the cycle of people that he remembers, he thinks again about his prisoner, the young American Tom, and he describes the face of the prisoner as being white and repulsive. And both of those words go together for the doctor, right? To Sadao, white is equal to repulsive. And yet, strange, he thought, I wonder why I could not kill him. And yet, Sadao could not kill him. And he still finds it strange by the end of the story. He's sort of I don't understand why I couldn't leave him to die, or why I couldn't kill him, or why I didn't just let the assassins kill him, or why I didn't pursue the general again and ask him to bring the assassins here. But we know very much why Sadao didn't kill him and couldn't kill him. And part of it is has to do with this sort of like cycle that he has gone through, all these people that he has like sort of like gone through, all of these Americans that he's known, that he's gotten to know as people. And so he knows that even if he thinks that he's better than them, they're still like human beings, and at the end of it, not people he necessarily wants to kill, even if he finds himself like completely like disgusted by them. Very, very interesting lessons. Let's talk about some themes really quickly, but first, if you have any questions, I'll take them. I'll give you like 30 seconds for like questions, and then I'll start talking about themes. Okay, no questions it is then. Couple of themes. First thing that we see is the power of a secret. We see this power first when it comes to the servants, the kind of power that they hold over their masters because they know this secret. Again, we see it in the case of the general. We see the power that Sadao holds over the general because of like the secret he has. The general forgot to send the assassins. But more than the power of a secret, more than the power of a secret, what we're really seeing is like a reversal of like traditional power like positions, right? The general is supposed to be more powerful, the master is supposed to be more powerful, but in both of these cases, the person who is supposed to be their subordinate, in the case of the general Sadao, and in the case of like Sadao and Hannah, the servants, end up holding positions of power over like their rulers, so to speak. And so we see that there's very much potential to like kind of work against these traditional like ideas of like, oh, this is who rules in this house and this is who like follows. There are moments to like break out of that, and there are definitely moments in which the less powerful are the more powerful also, can have power over the more powerful also. And second of all, we see this question of the politics of who lives and who doesn't live, right? Everyone is sort of like, this man doesn't deserve to live because he is white. And yet, if it was, the other way around, and it was a Japanese person in America, they'd say the same thing. So the politics of who lives has very much to do with the setting that we're in. Different lives have different kinds of worth everywhere, and that is a really troubling thing to think about. The fact that there is a politics at all to whose lives matter, but there very much is. And that conflict that we see is, and that sort of like idea that there is a politics to whose life matters enough to save them, whose life matters enough to keep them alive and not let them die, all of that filters into like the conflict that is at the center of the story, right? And that conflict is the conflict of being loyal to your state, to Japan here in the case of Sadao, or being loyal to like a human being, and to the notion of like human beings like being people who are alive and thus deserving life. So it's a conflict of, what do I care more for? Do I care more for my country, or do I care more for this human life? And it's a very incredibly difficult conflict, right? We can't just say it's a simple conflict and that, yeah, you should definitely care more about like the human being, because Sadao's in a tough place. There are going to be a lot of terrible consequences to him if he goes against his state, and he knows that. But secondly, he's also in a terrible place because he has been trained from his childhood by his father, as we saw in the first opening paragraphs, to be faithful to Japan, to think Japan comes first and foremost above everything. And he has shaped his life by that learning, right? He only marries Hannah because like she is completely Japanese. He brings her to his father and like follows the old Japanese customs before he marries Hannah. So he's actually like never done anything that goes against Japanese customs, that goes against Japan, that goes against his father. So very much he has been trained to not go against Japan at all. So the act of like helping someone who like everybody else would tell him it's wrong of him to help as Japanese is sort of him betraying a part of himself also, which is trained to think of his state as being the most important thing in his life. So it's very much also conflict against the self. Two different parts of the self, as we saw in Hannah. The part that's sort of like, as a Japanese person, I shouldn't want this American to live, and the part that's like, but why should I want him to die? So very much conflict of self against self is going on here. And that leads us to thinking about another like key theme here, which is that moment when Sadao calls his enemy his friend. Because in that moment, as we talked about in our class in the 3 to 4 like hour, at 3 to 4 p.m. When Sadao is operating and he's not really thinking like, oh, this is an American I am operating on, he calls him his friend because he calls all of his patients his friend. And in that moment, the man transforms into just another one of his patients, transforms into just another human being. And so the collapse of like that enemy-friend like divide, right? The idea that the American is a friend, is an enemy. And the idea that like a patient is someone that you treat like a human being. The man becomes the patient, and so he becomes a human being, and so he becomes a friend, even though he was an enemy. And it's a moment for us to think about like the potential of stopping looking at things like, oh, he is American and equal to enemy, or oh, he is white and equal to repulsive, but instead thinking, oh, he is human and so he is worthy of being alive. So it's an opportunity for us to think about how we can focus on a different aspect of a person's personality beyond just their nationality or their religion, or like multiple things really about them. And that way we can like see that, oh, this is a person and therefore they deserve to live and they deserve to be free and they deserve, for instance, as Hannah realizes, not to be tortured. Another thing that we get in the story is complicated reasoning. There is no clear morality. Sadao is not like a good person just because like he let like, well, he is a good person, but you can't say that he did this because it was the right thing, right? He goes back and forth a lot. Hannah goes back and forth a lot. In the end, the reason that Sadao finally lets this man escape is as much because like the assassins didn't come through and it was causing him stress, and he realized that he couldn't live like this, as it was the fact that he wanted this man to like be alive. In the beginning, if like on that very first night, assassins had come by and like murdered the man and taken him away, Sadao would have felt guilty about it, sure, but he would have still let it happen, right? So it's the prolonged nature of that waiting that really gets him to take some sort of action. And so we see that like sometimes our reasoning is really complicated and the decisions that we take are really complicated, and a lot depends on circumstance, a lot depends on the positions that we find ourselves in. And so yeah, difficult to like really point at Sadao and call him like the example of like human morality or something, but ultimately he comes to like a decision that works out well for everyone. And for that, all we can say is that matters, you know. It matters that that's what he did in the end, that it isn't something else that he chose to do. And so we can ultimately say, oh, he went through a lot, he almost made some really terrible decisions there, but in the end he made a decision that was good for everyone. And thank God for that, and thank goodness for that, and thank goodness his brain started working. So yeah, complicated reasoning, but ultimately things work out. And very finally, one last theme that we see in the story is definitely all these things that we tell ourselves, you know, all these lies that we tell ourselves really, because Sadao and Hannah are sort of like, oh, we don't want this man to live, we don't want this man to live, we don't want him to live, and all this time they're helping him live. So they're lying to themselves constantly, and even at the end, Sadao can't tell that, oh, I wanted him to live, I didn't let him die because I couldn't bring myself to kill him. He doesn't like, he isn't capable of like thinking that. He's just like, why did I do it? And that's because sometimes we just don't want to be completely honest with ourselves, because knowing that thing about ourselves can really complicate like our understanding of who we are, right? As Hannah tells us, two different parts in her. One part that is Japanese in like the way that Japanese should be, which definitely wants the American to just be handed over to the police. But another part of her that's not sure about this. And if she pays attention to the second part of her, the first part of her is going to get complicated, right? It's going to be like questioned, and she's going to have to work on like how she understands herself, things like that. And all of that's too difficult for us to do sometimes, so we just choose to lie to ourselves instead. Or we choose to ignore certain things about our personalities. In this case, Hannah and Sadao are ignoring things about themselves that are quite good of them, but in some cases we also do ignore things about ourselves that are definitely terrible of us, right? So yeah, that's one theme that we get from this story, and that brings us to, I think, the very end of this lesson, and my god, the end of like our literature portions for grade 12 term 1. I'm very out of breath. But I hope you liked that. I really like this lesson. I think it's a very important lesson. I think it's a very powerful lesson, especially in today's times, because so many divides today, so much like hatred, particularly with like, for instance, corona. There's all of this talk, for instance, just to like pick up one random example about like corona being the Chinese virus, and this sort of hatred that's being spewed in the direction of China because like the virus cropped up there. Yeah, things like that, hatred like that really doesn't make any sense, and divides like that don't make any sense either. And so this story is quite crucial at all points of time, especially if you're thinking about world politics, or even about like any kinds of politics, really. Because it's not only like divides on the basis of like countries, right? It's religious divides, it's divides on the basis of gender, it's divides on the basis of sexuality, it's divides on the basis of so many things that we've come up with. But yeah, very important story, basically. Anyway, thank you for like being here with me and listening to like however much of this you listened to, whether it was the first part, just the third part, both the like second and the third part. For all of it, thank you. I hope you had some fun. If you did, do leave a like, and do subscribe if you find such content interesting, because I'm making more content like this for you. Also leave me feedback if you think that I can improve in any way, or if there's anything in specific that you want to tell me about my teaching. All of that said, I want to tell you like quick couple of things. We will be doing a Vistas quiz on Wednesday from 3 to 4. We will be revising basically the third level, and we will be revising the enemy. So do come by and like take the quiz. It'll be kind of fun, and it'll be a good chance to revise. Yeah, that's all I wanted to tell you. A couple of things about Unacademy that I also want to share. One is that you can download the app off of Google Play Store or the Apple App Store, and it has access to a bunch of free features like the Ask a Doubt feature, which is particularly useful because you can basically ask any doubt that you have, and people will reply to you. They'll give you like answers, and that can be helpful, especially before exams. There's also something that Unacademy offers called Unacademy Plus, which is like YouTube but better, in the sense that it has a bunch of like courses that cover the entirety of the 11th and 12th syllabus. It will teach you like all your lessons, all your subjects. It has doubt clearing sessions, it has answer writing sessions, mock tests, live quizzes, things like that. So lots of benefits to Unacademy Plus, and these are the prices. Per month cost is a lot less if you take it for a longer duration of time, so you should consider taking it for a longer duration of time. Iconic by Unacademy is another subscription that Unacademy offers, in which you get to like access individualized learning. You get to work one-on-one with an educator, with educators, multiple. They'll clear your doubts, they'll kind of focus on what your needs are, and it'll be a very personalized learning experience. You'll get weekly reports about how you're doing, how you're performing in your tests and quizzes. Your parents will have office hours, open hours, parent-teacher days sort of, with the educators to hear on how you're doing. And you'll have access to like all of the other benefits of like Unacademy. So these are the prices of Unacademy. Iconic, again, per month cost is a lot lesser if you take it for a lot longer. You can use my referral code for these. My referral code is THAR01. That brings us to like the end of things that I had to say to you about Unacademy. Thanks for being here with me on the Unacademy platform, and I will see you again on